Richard. Meg had started school and was having a fine time. It made her feel so grown up to have a reading book with a green paper cover with a label saying, Margaret Peterson, 4th grade. Margaret, not Meg, because of course a schoolgirl can't be called by a baby name. It was lovely to have a little slate and a sponge tied to it with a string and a bottle filled with water to wet the slate when it needed cleaning. And it was fun to have a slate pencil and a pencil box to put it in and a canvas school bag to put the pencil box in. But the best thing of all was the little wooden hen her father gave her, which laid pennies, one after another, when Meg was a good girl and did her homework well. School was wonderful. And on the very first day, Meg had said with a sigh, "Oh dear, it's awful to think of Christmas vacation coming." It was almost 4 months until Christmas, but still. Meg showed the reading book, the slate, and the pencil box to Betsy, Mother, Father, Ida, Alva, and Albert Nielsen. She let Betsy thumb through the book and write a tiny bit on the slate, all the while giving a lot of advice. Every morning when Meg left for school, Betsy stood on the veranda, wishing that she too could walk off with a beautiful school bag on her back. It seemed such an endless time before Meg came home, and when she finally did, she had homework to do. She practiced her reading in the children's room, but so loudly that you could hear her all over the house. Betsy didn't understand why anyone had to read the same thing over and over again the way Meg did. But then, she wasn't a schoolgirl. Every day at the dinner table, Father asked, "Well, Meg, how are you doing in school?" "Fine," Meg would answer. "I'm the best one in my class." One day, Mother asked, "Who says that? You or the teacher?" "Oh, we both think so," said Meg. Father and Mother exchanged pleased looks. There, you see? They'd been worrying for nothing. School could make something out of even a little wildcat like Meg. But as the days went by, Meg didn't do her homework quite so eagerly. Mother often had to remind her to do her arithmetic, and the reading was no longer heard from the children's room. There was just the usual noise of Meg and Betsy climbing on the furniture and overturning the chairs. One day, there was another sound. Meg was singing, "Put your arms around me, Adolphina. Put your arms around me." Mother didn't like that. "Oh, Meg, what a silly song. Who taught you that?" Mother didn't know about the gramophone in the Nielsen's house, a strange-looking thing with a big horn. Mr. Nielsen played Come Adolphina every day and danced with Mrs. Nielsen. The gramophone made a great rasping and hissing noise, but you could still hear the tune coming out of the horn. Mother didn't seem to like the Nielsens, and she objected to Meg's visiting them for some reason. "Well, Meg," said Mother again, "who taught you that silly song?" Meg began to blush. "Richard," she said. She didn't want to confess that she had heard it at the Nielsens. "Who is Richard?" asked Betsy. "Richard, he's in my class," Meg said hastily. "Oh," said Mother, "I don't think you ought to associate with that boy." A day or two later, the wooden hen laid a penny for Meg, even though she really hadn't been working as hard as she might have. For a penny, she could get 2 pieces of butterscotch in the little candy store near the school. She promised to give Betsy one, and Betsy looked forward to it all day. When Meg finally came home, Betsy was waiting for her in the hall. "Oh, poor Betsy," said Meg. "Richard ate your butterscotch." Betsy was very sad and disappointed. Richard should have a good spanking, she said. Richard certainly should have been spanked, because that wasn't the last time he played a mean trick. One day, Meg came home with only one of her galoshes. The other one had vanished. They were beautiful galoshes, black and shiny with red linings. "Where is your other galosh?" Mother asked. "Richard threw it in the canal." "That Richard should have a good spanking," said Betsy. Mother was terribly annoyed with Richard. "How unfortunate to have a boy like that in your class. I think I'll have to go and have a talk with your teacher." But Mother was so busy that she didn't get around to seeing the teacher, and Richard went on playing pranks. There was a new one almost every day. Meg came home with a splotch of ink on her new dress. Richard, of course. One day her slate was cracked right across. Richard had thrown it against the wall because he wanted to see if it was strong. It wasn't. Not that strong. In one of Meg's books, there was a picture of a queen who had lived in Sweden a long time ago. All of a sudden, one day, the queen had a beard and mustache. "But, Margaret, why have you scribbled in your book?" asked Mother severely. "I didn't. It was Richard," Meg said. "That Richard should have a good spanking," said Betsy. Almost every day at the dinner table, Meg told stories about Richard and his terrible pranks. The teacher had a dreadful time with him. He was always making a racket in class and having to stand in the corner. Once Meg said, "You know what he did today? He ate my eraser." "He ate your eraser?" exclaimed Mother in a horrified voice. "There must be something wrong with that boy," said Father. "That Richard should have a good spanking," said Betsy. One day, Meg came home with a new hairdo. Richard had been up to tricks again. On the way home from school, he had borrowed Meg's sewing scissors and cut bangs on her. And what bangs! That was the end of Mother's patience. Such mischief couldn't be allowed to go on for another day. "Tomorrow I'm going to school and talk to your teacher," she said firmly. "That Richard should have—" began Betsy. "Be quiet," Meg cried angrily. "Richard can't have a spanking because he left school today." "He left school?" Mother was astonished. "Yes, he didn't want to go to school any longer," Meg explained. "Didn't want to?" said Mother. "What nonsense! He's probably going to another school." "Yes, maybe he's going to another school to eat erasers," said Betsy, pleased. 2 days later, Aunt Lottie had a birthday. She lived in a little yellow house right next to the school, and Mother took Meg and Betsy to wish her a happy day. Right outside Aunt Lottie's house, whom should they meet but Meg's teacher? Meg didn't want to talk to the teacher at all, but Mother did. Meg tugged at Mother's skirt, but Mother paid no attention. "How is Margaret doing at school?" she asked. There was really no reason to ask, because Meg herself had said that everything was fine. But Mother wanted to hear the teachers say that Meg was best in her class. Strangely enough, the teacher didn't say that at all. "Things will probably improve when Margaret gets a little more used to being in 4th grade," she said. "Some children have a hard time with the work at first." Mother looked puzzled. "Do you really think that Margaret is one of those children?" What then could she possibly think of Richard? "That Richard," said Mother. "Thank goodness he has left. It must be a relief to get rid of such a troublesome child." It was the teacher's turn to look puzzled. "Richard? We haven't had a boy named Richard." "But—" Mother began. Then she stopped and looked severely at Meg. "That Richard should have a good spanking," said Betsy. Meg blushed crimson red and stared at her shoes. "A spanking?" Betsy said. Somebody was going to get one, but who? Meg was already missing Richard terribly. Meg and Betsy have a picnic at home. Meg never talked about Richard again. This made Betsy sad. She couldn't understand why there didn't seem to be a Richard anymore. She especially missed him at the dinner table, and sometimes she would say, "I wonder what Richard is doing in his new school." Then Meg would scowl furiously at her. Mother would pretend she hadn't heard anything, but Father would laugh and pull Meg's hair. One day he said, "Well, Meg, you certainly spun some fine yarns, didn't you? Now suppose you tell us about school without Richard." Meg began by telling about the teacher's watch, such a pretty one on a long chain, and about the boys fighting in the schoolyard every day, and about what fun it was to sit in the corridor and eat sandwiches during the lunch hour. Betsy wanted to know everything about school. "What do the children have in their sandwiches?" she asked. "Sausage and cheese," said Meg. Betsy sighed. How lucky some children were. They could sit in the corridor eating sandwiches with sausage and cheese and have pencil boxes, slates, school bags. Betsy thought it was unfair that she couldn't go to school, too. Father went on asking questions. The next day at the dinner table, he said again, "Well, how was school today?" Meg stopped to think. Now that Richard wasn't there anymore, there wasn't very much to tell, but she could always think of something. "There's a girl called Mia in my class, and she has funny little things that crawl in her hair," Meg began. "I wish I had some, too." Mother gasped. "No, thank you." Betsy was just about to take a mouthful of mashed potatoes, but instead, she put down her fork and said triumphantly, "In my school, all the children have funny little things in their hair." "Don't be silly," Meg snapped. "You don't even go to school." "I do so," Betsy insisted stubbornly. Father laughed. "Meg isn't the only one who can tell good stories," he said. "So, you have a school too, Betsy. I suppose that's the one Richard has moved to." Betsy's face brightened. What a wonderful idea! Dresses and shoes weren't the only things she could inherit from Meg. She could inherit Richard, too, and have him in her school. Betsy nodded and smiled broadly. "Yes, Richard is in my school now, and he has so many funny little things in his hair." "Oh, you are so silly, Betsy," said Meg crossly. The weeks went by, and one day in late October, Meg came rushing home from school, all excited, her eyes sparkling. "Is Mother home?" she cried as she came flying in at the door. From that moment on, she didn't stop talking. "Mother, we're going on a picnic on Wednesday, the whole school. We're taking a train, and then we're going to walk a long way, and then we're going to climb to the top of a mountain and sit and eat sandwiches and look at the view. Oh, I'm so happy." She couldn't sit still, but skipped joyfully around the room. She threw her arms around her mother, and her whole face was radiant. But Betsy's face was dark as a thundercloud. At first, she greeted the news with silence. But then she said emphatically, "My school is having a picnic too, and we're taking a train and climbing a much higher mountain." "Oh, that's a good one," jeered Meg. "You're just horrid," cried Betsy, and buried her head in Mother's lap, sobbing as if her heart were breaking. "I want to have a picnic too, and sit on a mountain and eat sandwiches." Then Meg felt like comforting Betsy. "We can have a picnic, the two of us," she said kindly. Betsy cried a little longer, just to be on the safe side. Then she looked up, her eyes still full of tears. "And sit on a mountain?" she asked. "Maybe," said Meg, "if we can find one." "That was nice of you, Meg," Mother said. "You two can have a picnic all by yourselves. That will be fun, won't it, Betsy? And you can go today, because Father and I are going to lunch at the Berglunds. We'll pack a picnic basket, and you can take it to some nice place," she added, stroking Betsy's cheek. "To a nice mountain," Betsy corrected her. Mother got out the red picnic basket from the closet and filled it with good things. Tiny meatballs, sausages, a couple of hard-boiled eggs, 2 pieces of apple cake, a bottle of milk, and 2 cinnamon buns. "You and Father won't get this many good things to eat at the Berglunds," said Meg. Mother was in a hurry, but while she was putting on her hat and coat, she cautioned Meg. "Don't go too far away, and be sure to tell Alva where you're going." Just as she was leaving, she called to Alva. "Please keep an eye on the children while I'm gone." "Yes, ma'am, I certainly will," Alva answered as the front door closed. Meg and Betsy carried the red basket between them. This was going to be a real picnic. "Where can we find a mountain?" Betsy wanted to know. Meg stood for a moment on the veranda steps, thinking. There was no mountain nearby, and Mother had said they mustn't go very far away. But as Ida said, Meg got her ideas as fast as a pig can blink, and she didn't have to think very long. Suddenly, she remembered a story Mother had read to them a long time ago about some children who were going on a picnic, just like Meg and Betsy. And they had a basket full of pancakes with them. But instead of going into the woods, they climbed up on the roof of the pigsty, and all the pancakes fell down to the pigs. That had been a funny story. "Betsy," Meg said, "we don't have a mountain, but we could climb up on the woodshed." Betsy jumped up and down with delight. "Just like those children," she said, "but we have no pancakes." "And no pigs," Meg added, "so it won't make any difference if we should happen to drop the basket." "Do you think Mother will let us?" Betsy asked. Meg thought again for a moment. "Mother said that we should go to some nice place not too far away. The woodshed is a nice place, and from there we'll have a view just like the one I'll have on Wednesday." Just then Alva came running out of the house. "You have to tell me where you're going." "Not far," Meg said. "We're going to stay home." Betsy giggled. "Not far at all. We're going to the—" "Be quiet," said Meg. "I told you. We're staying home." Alva was satisfied and went back to finish her ironing in peace. There was a ladder leaning against the gable end of the woodshed. Meg had used it many times to climb up on the roof. Sometimes she even walked carefully, like someone on a tightrope, all the way over to where the branches of the Nielsen's tree hung over the laundry roof. Meg liked those little August pears. Betsy sometimes climbed on the ladder too, but only on the lowest rungs. Now she was going to go all the way up to the roof, and it seemed both wonderful and a little alarming. But that is probably the way all picnics are, she thought. Meg started climbing first. Although she was carrying the basket, she went up quite quickly and easily. Betsy climbed slowly behind her, and the higher up she got, the slower she went. At last, the tip of her nose was above the ridge of the roof, and she could see Meg sitting there, starting to unpack all the goodies. But Betsy no longer felt that the roof was a very nice place. She was suddenly convinced that a real mountain would be better. "Meg, you know what?" she said in a small voice. "I don't want to climb up on this roof." "Now don't start fussing or there won't be any picnic," said Meg. "Come on, I'll help you." Betsy was so frightened that she was trembling, but Meg pulled and tugged and finally managed to drag her up on the roof. Betsy moaned the whole time. "You're crazy, Meg. You're absolutely crazy." When they finally settled astride the ridge, with the basket between them, Betsy began to feel more at ease. "I can look right into the Nielsen's kitchen," she said. Meg looked pleased. "Didn't I tell you we'd have a view? We can see what the Nielsens are doing. I've often been up here." They sat there for a long time, peering through the Nielsen's kitchen window. There was Albert, baking as usual. Mrs. Nielsen wasn't around, but Mr. Nielsen was lying on the sofa, sleeping. "What a lazy man," Meg said. Albert looked up and saw them, and stopped his work. He moved over to the window and began to make such funny faces that they laughed until they almost fell off the roof. Meg couldn't understand how anyone could twist up his face the way Albert could. When he wasn't making faces, Meg thought he was very good-looking. His hair was very blonde, his eyes bright blue, and he had a nice, wide mouth. But when he made all those queer faces, he looked just like a troll. Not handsome at all, but so funny. You almost fell off the roof just looking at him. After a while, he came outside. "Hi," he said, looking up at Meg and Betsy. "How are you up there?" "Oh, we're just fine," said Meg. Nothing could be more fun than sitting on the woodshed roof and talking to Albert. "We're having a picnic," Betsy explained. "So I see," said Albert. "What do you have in the basket?" "Meatballs, sausages, and all sorts of good things," said Meg. "Quite a lot of good things," Betsy added. Albert was leaning on the fence that separated June Hill from Peaceful Villa. That was the name of the Nielsen's place. He was quiet and seemed to be thinking about something. At last he said, "I bet you can't throw a meatball into my mouth. Do you want to try?" Meg and Betsy thought this was a splendid idea. No one could invent as many clever things as Albert. "Ha, you'll see," said Meg, and quickly picked up a meatball, which she aimed carefully at his open mouth. But the meatball hit Albert right on the forehead and bounced off into a bed of yellow leaves. Quick as a wink, Albert picked it up and stuffed it into his mouth. "What did I tell you? You can't aim. Now you've proved it." "We'll see this time," said Meg, and picked up another meatball. That one whizzed right past Albert's ear and fell on the ground. Albert picked it up and it disappeared into his mouth. "There, you've proved it again. You just can't aim, Meg." "Now I'm going to try," said Betsy. "I want to throw meatballs too." She tossed one without aiming at all, and it didn't even reach the fence. "Bad shots, both of you," said Albert. He thrust a floury hand between the pickets of the fence and grabbed the meatball. Meg and Betsy tried several times more, but finally Meg said, "Now we couldn't aim if we wanted to because all the meatballs are gone." "It might be easier with the sausages," Albert suggested. "They're easier to handle. Let's try it." Meg and Betsy were only too glad to try with the sausages. Once, Meg hit Albert right between the eyes, but that was the best she could do. "Now there are only 2 sausages left," Meg said, "and we're going to eat them ourselves." "Well, don't think I have time to stand here all day just being a target for you to practice on," said Albert. "So long, kids. Now you'll have to get yourselves another target." He disappeared into the kitchen. "Let's have the picnic now," said Betsy, which meant that she wanted to start eating. They ate the last 2 sausages, the eggs, the apple cake, and the cinnamon buns. Everything tasted good, and they had more than enough to eat, even though they had tossed away the meatballs and almost all the sausages. As they were drinking their milk, Betsy's glass overturned, and a small white rivulet ran down the tiles toward the gutter. Just think how surprised the sparrows will be when they find milk in the gutter, Meg said.
Yes, and happy too, said Betsy. What are we going to do now, Maggie?
We have to look at the view a little longer, because that's the reason for going on picnics, Meg explained.
Is it?
Asked Betsy doubtfully.
Yes, that's what the teacher says, and that's what we're going to do on Wednesday. But the boys say they don't care about the view, they just want to have fun.
But Meg and Betsy were not like the boys. They stared at the view as hard as they could, and not only into the Nielsen's kitchen. They turned their heads in every direction, just as you're supposed to do on a picnic. They could see the river all the way to the bend, the willow trees leaning out over the water, and the houses and gardens along the banks. The yellow and red autumn leaves were beautiful, and the sky was blue and clear. They leaned backward and gazed at the sky so as not to miss seeing every possible view. A bird was flying high over their heads.
"What a view he must have!" exclaimed Meg. "I wish I could fly." "People can't fly," said Betsy.
"Yes, in airplanes they can," Meg corrected her. "Albert has told me all about airplanes." Meg would have given anything to see an airplane, although Ida had told her it was a sin to fly. "If God wanted people to fly, he would have made birds of them," said Ida. Betsy said she thought airplanes were very strange.
"But they aren't the only ones that can fly. Peter Pan can fly too, you know."
"Oh, you're silly, Betsy," said Meg. But then the wheels started going round in her mind. Albert had once told her that during the war, people jumped down from airplanes with big umbrellas. Of course, Meg understood that it wasn't possible to fly all over the place, but it seemed to work all right if you just wanted to come down to Earth from an airplane or some other high place. Meg pondered this. The woodshed was a high place. "I think I'll try," said Meg.
"Try what?"
Betsy asked. "To fly with an umbrella," was Meg's solemn answer. When Betsy heard what Meg was planning to do, she laughed so hard that she cried.
"You're crazy, Maggie," she said. "Are we going to pretend that you're Peter Pan?"
"No, we're not going to pretend that I'm Peter Pan. Don't be silly, don't you see? I'm going to make believe that I'm jumping out of an airplane."
"You are crazy, Maggie," said Betsy again.
Somehow, Meg would have to sneak Father's big umbrella out of the stand in the hall without Alva's seeing her, because she wasn't at all sure that Alva would understand about flying with an umbrella. Perhaps she had never heard how things are done in wars, and she might start trouble. Betsy stopped laughing when she realized that she was going to be left alone on the roof. But Meg consoled her.
"You can watch the Nielsens while I'm away. Just sit still and don't move, and you won't fall down."
With this, Meg disappeared down the ladder. She wandered over casually to take a look into the kitchen. Alva was standing there, ironing and perspiring. She had to keep the fire going in order to keep the irons hot, and the kitchen was like an oven, even with the windows open. "I'm glad you're here so that I don't have to go out to keep an eye on you. How's the picnic going?"
"Just fine,"
said Meg. "Where is Betsy?" Alva wanted to know.
"She's at the picnic place,"
said Meg, and slipped into the hall before Alva had a chance to ask any more questions. There was Father's umbrella in the umbrella stand. Meg grabbed it as Alva opened the door. "Is Sasso with you?" she asked. "No," said Meg, trying to hide the umbrella behind her back. "Then he's run away as usual," said Alva. "What are you doing with that umbrella?"
"I thought, in case it should rain."
"Rain? Today? That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. Put that umbrella back." Meg was annoyed.
She didn't have time to stand here discussing the weather when she was about to fly for the first time in her life. "You should always have an umbrella on a picnic," she said. "Suppose it should rain. Then we'd really be in a fix." Alva laughed. The weather wouldn't change any faster than you could run for shelter on the veranda. "But take the umbrella if you insist. Be sure to bring it back, though, or your father will be cross." "Yes, yes, yes," said Meg impatiently, and dashed out the veranda door. Everything was so quiet, you wouldn't have thought there was a living creature at June Hill. A most remarkable flight was about to take place, and there wasn't a soul to watch. No one, that is, but Betsy. Alva's kitchen window looked in the other direction. Albert had disappeared into Peaceful Villa. Mr. Nielsen was still sound asleep on the sofa. So, only Betsy was there to see Meg's flight. Only Betsy saw how Meg stood on the edge of the roof and opened the big black umbrella. Only Betsy saw how she lifted it high over her head and got ready to jump. "You're crazy," said Betsy. "You're absolutely crazy." "Silly, it isn't dangerous," Meg retorted, though the ground looked very far away. But after all, if people could jump from airplanes a couple of 1,000 feet up in the air, then it certainly should be possible to do it from the woodshed roof. Meg stood poised for a moment, holding the umbrella over her head, and made noises like an airplane. Albert had never even seen or heard an airplane, but he knew what they sounded like and had taught Meg. Albert seemed to know everything. "Put, put, put," stuttered Meg. "Oh, dear," wailed Betsy. Then Meg took off. She walked right out into the air. Then there was a thud. "That went quicker than lightning," Betsy cried. She wriggled on her stomach to the edge of the roof and peered down. Meg was lying absolutely still, with her face toward the ground, and didn't answer. Beside her was the umbrella, its handle broken in two. "What's the matter with you?" cried Betsy. "Are you dead?" Meg still didn't answer. "Maggie, tell me if you're dead," screamed Betsy frantically. There was no sound from Meg. Then Betsy began to scream in earnest. "Mother! Mother!" She felt as if she were all alone in the world, and she couldn't even get down from the roof. In the midst of her shouting, Mr. Nielsen poked his head out of the window. "What are you doing up there, and why are you making such a racket?" "Maggie is dead," cried Betsy. "Maggie is dead." Mr. Nielsen quickly climbed out of the window and jumped over the fence. He knelt on the grass beside Meg and turned her face toward him. She was very pale, and there was blood on her forehead. Now Alva came running. She stopped and moaned at the sight of Meg. "What in heaven's name has happened?" Mr. Nielsen sadly shook his head. "It's all over," he said in a hushed voice. "There is no more little Meg at June Hill." A sad, happy day. Meg was lying in bed with a bandage around her head. She wasn't allowed to move.
"Only when you feel sick," said Betsy. "Then you can move a little."
Meg wasn't dead, and Betsy was happy about that. She just had a brain concussion, which isn't as bad as being dead. It makes you feel pretty sick. But you don't die, Dr. Berglund said. Just the same, all of June Hill had been in an uproar when Meg had tried to fly, and then wouldn't wake up for a long time. Mother had cried, and Father had cried, but not as much as Mother, and Alva had cried harder than Mother and Father put together. "Oh, it's all my fault," Alva groaned. "But how could I guess that she was taking the umbrella to fly with?" Now Meg lay in bed and couldn't remember at all what it felt like to fly, which annoyed her very much, because that meant that it was all for nothing. On top of everything, she had this miserable brain concussion. She had to stay in bed at least 4 days, Dr. Berglund said. Meg had let out a shriek when Mother told her. 4 days? That's impossible. The school picnic is on a Wednesday and I'm... "You certainly are not," said Mother. "You've had enough picnicking." Betsy nodded in agreement.
You've had enough picnics. Now you have to lie in bed and be sick.
At that, Meg started a real earthquake. That was what Father called it when she got furious and desperate, as only Meg could. The tears streamed down her face, and she screamed so loud she could be heard all over the house. "I want to go on the picnic! I'm going on the picnic! Oh, I wish I were dead!" Betsy looked at her curiously and tried to console her.
In my school, all the children have brain concussions and can't go on any picnics at all.
Mother also tried to console Meg. "If you cry that way, your headache will become worse." "I don't care," Meg went on howling. "I wish I were dead." Mother looked sad and went out of the room. Ida was down in the kitchen, helping Alva to can applesauce. And when she heard the wild shouts, she came up to the children's room and looked severely at Meg. "Margaret? Margaret! Now you're being sinful. Think of what the Bible says, and don't lie here wishing yourself dead." But Meg didn't want to think about anything but the picnic, and she screamed at Ida. "Leave me alone!" Ida shook her head and looked worried. "So, that's the way it is," she said. "I see that Sebastian Loki is back in the house." Ida couldn't think of anything worse than Sebastian Loki. He came to the house when Meg and Betsy were not as good as Ida thought they ought to be. The person lying in bed screaming wasn't Meg at all. It was really Sebastian Loki. And the real Meg, the good little girl, was sitting up in the chimney until Sebastian Loki decided it was time to leave. "Oh, what bad luck that he happened to come today," said Ida.
That's all right, said Betsy, because now he can have the headache and feel sick, and Meg can sit in the chimney and have a lot of fun.
Meg just glared at Ida and Betsy. The business about Sebastian Loki was all right for Betsy, but Meg was too big for such childish nonsense. "Calm down," said Ida. "Just be happy you're alive. You weren't far from flying yourself to death." But Meg couldn't be happy. She pulled the covers over her head and cried. Every morning for the next few days, she woke up hoping for a miracle, such as Mother coming into her room and saying, "Oh, what's a little brain concussion anyway? Besides, picnics are the best cure for brain concussions. Don't you think you'll be well enough to go along on Wednesday after all?" But Mother didn't say anything of the kind. She only stroked Meg's cheek and smiled encouragingly. "Don't be sad," she said. "We'll think of something else that will be fun." Something else that's fun? As if there could be anything in the whole wide world that was fun, except that picnic. On Tuesday night, Meg prayed for help. She lay with the covers pulled over her head and whispered so that Betsy wouldn't hear her. "Please, God,
help me, because I would so much like to go. Make Dr. Berglund call Mother and tell her I'm fine, because I am. But do it right away if we're going to manage everything on time. I have to have sandwiches and chocolate, and Alva has to iron my new sailor dress. So please tell Dr. Berglund to call immediately. Please, dear God, because I would so much like to go. Amen. Then Meg lay there, listening intently for the telephone to ring. But no telephone rang. All she heard was Betsy, who kept nagging from her bed.
Tell me stories about ghosts and cops and robbers.
But Meg didn't want to tell stories. She lay for a long time listening for the telephone that never rang. Then she cried a little under the covers before she fell asleep. On Wednesday morning, she woke up early. The sun was shining in a blue, blue sky. What a wonderful day for all the lucky school children who didn't have a brain concussion. She peered at the clock. Almost 8. Just the time the train would be leaving. All her classmates would be gathered at the station, and she could just see them laughing and talking and rushing into the train, squabbling about the window seats and having a good time while they waited for the train to pull out. Meg stared miserably at the cuckoo clock hanging on the wall above her bed. She watched the hands move as it ticked closer and closer toward 8. Then the cuckoo popped out and called, "Cuckoo!" 8 times. Meg burst into tears because she knew the train had left. Poor, poor Meg. Having to stay in bed and never having any fun. Betsy woke up in fine spirits. She didn't realize what a sad day it was, and sang the ABCD song just the way Meg had taught her. Meg snapped at her. "Be quiet, you horrid little brat! Be quiet, I tell you! Shut up!"
Oh, so Sebastian Loki is back,
said Betsy calmly, sounding just like Ida. Just then the door opened, and Mother came in, carrying a tray beautifully arranged with 2 great big blue cups of hot chocolate on it, and waffles. Betsy opened her eyes wide.
"Is it my birthday?"
she asked. "No," said Mother, "but sometimes it's nice to celebrate without a birthday. Sit up, Meggie, and have some hot chocolate and waffles." Meg slowly crawled out from under the bedclothes. Her eyes were wet. Mother kissed her and served her chocolate and waffles. Without a word, Meg began to eat. She sat there, quietly stuffing herself with one waffle after another. There were still tears on her eyelashes, and this was a very sad day. But just the same, the waffles and hot chocolate were delicious. Betsy heartily agreed.
"It tastes just like a regular birthday."
"Of course it does," said Mother as she left the room. Betsy's breakfast had disappeared rapidly, and she licked the last traces of sugar and butter from her fingers before she climbed purposefully out of bed. Just as she finished dressing, the doorbell rang.
"It's the mailman," she said. "Maggie, do you want me to go down and see if there's anything for us?"
Betsy and Meg didn't often get any mail, but to be on the safe side, they looked in the mailbox every morning. Now Meg just shrugged her shoulders. This was a sad day, so why should there be any mail? Betsy ran down anyway. Meg was left alone, and her thoughts went back to the picnic. She looked at the clock. The train ride must be over by now, and they'd probably be walking along the road, singing. She could see them clearly as they went marching along 2 by 2. Now they would have reached the mountain where they were going to have the picnic. And here was Meg, lying in bed and never having any fun.
Then Betsy came running up the stairs, completely out of breath.
Maggie, guess what? She cried. You have 3 cards and a package.
I have? Meg sat up eagerly in bed. Meg and Betsy collected postcards, and each of them had an album almost full. On birthdays and holidays, they received the most wonderful cards. Sometimes there were flowers on them, sometimes dear little kittens or puppies, and sometimes handsome men with beards and ladies in beautiful dresses. Some of the cards were shiny, and those were the most beautiful of all. Now, Meg had got 3 of these shiny cards all at once, although there was no birthday or holiday to celebrate, just a brain concussion. Meg was thrilled with her cards. Oh, how beautiful they were. On the first one, there was a white dove holding a red rose in its beak. On the second, a pink angel soaring in a dark blue sky full of shiny gold stars. And on the third, a little boy dressed in velvet with a bouquet of yellow roses. Meg looked at them all and sighed with bliss.
Look and see who sent them,
Betsy reminded her, and Meg quickly turned the cards over. From a friend, it said in printed letters on all 3 of them.
What do you think that means?
Asked Meg. Their cards usually came from grandmother or the cousins, not from a friend. To receive cards from an unknown friend was something very new and strange.
Perhaps they're from Albert,
Betsy suggested. Sending me 3 cards? Said Meg. He's not crazy, I hope. She was so happy about the cards that she had almost forgotten about the package. But now she pounced on it and began to unwrap it. There was a box inside, and inside the box, a lot of pink tissue paper. Meg and Betsy looked at each other, quivering with excitement. Almost anything could be inside that pink paper, and it was a delightful feeling not to know what it was. Meg bent down and sniffed it. What do you suppose it could be? Betsy sniffed at the paper.
I don't know.
Do you think I ought to look? Asked Meg.
Absolutely,
said Betsy. The tissue paper rustled under Meg's eager fingers while Betsy held her breath. Under the top layer, there was a letter. To Maggie from grandmother, it said on the envelope, but that wasn't all. Underneath, there was a tiny baby doll and a tiny little bathtub for the baby to bathe in, and a tiny little bottle to feed her with, and a tiny piece of soap to wash her with. And then there was a tiny little bag of beads to make necklaces with, and 2 little green boxes with pretty pictures on the covers, each with a pink candy and a ring inside. Betsy's eyes opened wide as she looked at everything. She was very quiet for a minute, and then she said solemnly,
I wish I could have a brain concussion too.
Meg took one of the little boxes in each hand. Which one would you like? She asked. Would you rather have a ring with a red stone or a ring with a blue stone?
A green one,
said Betsy. Silly, there isn't any green one, said Meg.
Then I'll take a blue one,
Betsy said.
Oh, that's awfully nice of you, Maggie.
Meg herself thought it was awfully nice of her, and it felt good not to be sad any longer, and not to have to think about the picnic. Mountains are all right, she said, but I still think we had a better view from the woodshed.
Absolutely, said Betsy, because we could look into the Nielsen's kitchen.
Meg and Betsy put their rings on. They stretched out their fingers and felt like elegant ladies. My stone looks like a drop of blood, said Meg. What does yours look like?
Mine looks like blue,
said Betsy. And that, of course, was true. For a long time they compared rings.
They put their hands next to each other and discussed which was the prettier. It ended with Meg thinking that red stones were prettier because they look like drops of blood, and Betsy thinking that blue stones are prettier because they're blue. Meg suddenly remembered that she hadn't read Grandmother's letter and tore open the envelope. Grandmother had printed the letter because Meg couldn't read handwriting very well yet. Betsy couldn't understand how Meg figured out what Grandmother said just by looking at some squiggles in a letter.
"Can you really read that?" she asked.
Of course Meg could read it. When she had spelled her way through the letter, she knew exactly what Grandmother wanted. She wanted Meg to give up flying completely. And she wanted Meg to give Betsy one of the little boxes and half of the beads in the bead bag.
"Don't you think I'm kind, Betsy? I gave you the box before I read the letter," Meg said. "Yes, you were very kind," said Betsy, and grabbed the bead bag. "Give me my beads. Now I'm going to make a necklace."
But Meg pulled the bead bag out of her hand.
"Leave them alone," she said. "You have to wait until I have time to divide them." "You have time now," said Betsy. "I just don't happen to feel like it."
She poured a glass of water from the carafe on the table beside her bed and drank in long, slow swallows until the glass was empty. Then she took the pink tissue paper and began to fold it very carefully. She folded and folded so that anyone could see that she was too busy to count the beads. All this time she was thinking, the little box was a better present than a bag of beads. Still, it was easier to give the box to Betsy than to divide the beads with her. Meg wanted very much to keep all the beads. But she knew that if Betsy didn't get any, she would go to Mother and tattle, and then Meg would have to share them with her anyway. She replaced the tissue paper in the box as neatly and carefully and deliberately as she could, and then she sighed and said, "Now I have time." She poured the beads onto a tray and divided them into 2 even piles. One big yellow bead was left over, and this she gave to Betsy. "You take it," she said, for Meg was never stingy for more than a few minutes at a time. When Meg and Betsy had made necklaces and put them on, they were even more elegant than before. Then they played with the little baby doll. They bathed her in the little tub, washing her with a little soap, which smelled perfectly delicious. Then they made a bed for her in a cigar box and gave her a bottle. "This is a very sad day," said Meg, "but we're having fun." Betsy heartily agreed. "Yes, it's a sad, happy day." But after a while, she got bored and wanted to go outside. "I'm going to take Sasso for a walk," she said, and was gone in a flash. It was no fun playing alone, and soon Meg was bored and couldn't think what to do. But then Father came home for lunch and stopped in to see her. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Fine," said Meg, "but I've nothing to do." "You can read the paper," Father said, and took it out of his pocket. "Here's a pad, too. Make a good drawing to give me when I come home for dinner." Meg had learned to read so capably that even the teacher was surprised. When Father had gone, she immediately opened the newspaper, but she didn't understand much of what it said. There was a lot about war, and advertisements about pigs and cows for sale, about people who had got married or engaged, and about women's coats and dresses. There was a great deal more, but none of it interested Meg. She read the headings. One column was called "From Long Ago." Could that possibly be any fun? She didn't know what long ago was, but she soon found out. It was all about what people did years and years before Meg was born. Poor things, how bored they must have been. She sighed
and put the paper down. It certainly was strange that Father was so funny and gay, and yet wrote such a dull newspaper. Since he was the editor, he must decide what was going to be in it, and why couldn't he find anything amusing to write about? It probably wasn't easy to write newspapers. She decided to make a newspaper so she could find out for herself. It wouldn't be printed, of course, but she could write it on the pad, and she could cut the headlines out of Father's paper. Then everything would look almost right. With her pad and pencil, a pair of scissors, and some paste in front of her on the tray, Meg got to work. She cut "From Long Ago" out of Father's paper and pasted it at the top of the pad. Then she had to say something underneath. She chewed thoughtfully on her pencil and then wrote, "Now I am going to tell what the children did a long time ago. They were good to their mothers, but some were mean, not so very good exactly. They had flint axes, but they soon learned to shoot with guns." But Meg soon got tired of times gone by. She cut out a news headline from Father's paper, "From the War Front." She pasted that on a new page of the pad. Again she chewed on her pencil. After thinking for a while, she wrote, "The war is terrible. The soldiers lie in trenches and have cold feet. But a soldier jumped down from an airplane with an umbrella and didn't get a brain concussion." That ended the war for Meg. She looked through Father's paper to get some new ideas. Notices. They were probably an important part of a real newspaper. She cut out the heading "Deceased" and pasted it on a new page. Then she gnawed on her pencil deep in thought. After a while, she began to write, looking very pleased with herself. When she had finished, she drew a black border around what she had written. Then she decided she didn't want to make a newspaper any longer. It would be more fun to draw. So she made a picture for her father which showed her flying from the woodshed, and it turned out very well. She gave it to Father when he came home for dinner, and he thought it was good too. Meg sat up at the table for dinner, dressed in a bathrobe. Maybe she wasn't strong enough to go on picnics, but she was strong enough to eat, especially dessert. Later on, when Meg and Betsy were lying in their beds ready to go to sleep, Mother and Father came in to say good night. Mother told them a story about Prince Hat, who lived under the ground, and Father made shadow figures on the wall. At first, the light was too dim, so Father took off the lampshade. Then the shadow figures became very clear as they moved on the wall. Sometimes there was a goat with 2 big horns, sometimes a girl dancing, and yet they were only the shadows of Father's fingers. It was so nice to have both Mother and Father in the room at the same time that Meg wished she could keep them there for hours and hours. But after a while, Mother said, "Now you must go to sleep." Betsy was already asleep, but Meg lay awake for a long time, thinking about the picnic again. It was all over now, and the day after tomorrow she would go back to school, and she knew that all her classmates would be talking about what a marvelous time they had had. But not Meg. Oh, why couldn't she have been there? She could see a great many stars through the crack at the top of the window shade, and they looked bigger than usual. They were almost as pretty as the stars on her card, the one with the angels. She tried to count them, but it didn't work. You get sleepy when you count stars. Now all of June Hill was sleeping by its peaceful river among the white birch trees. Mother was the only one in the whole house who was still awake. She tiptoed into the children's room to tuck in her girls, and found a paper lying on the floor near Meg's bed. She picked it up and read by the light of the night lamp. "Deceased,
Thank goodness our nasty, mean Sebastian Loki is dead. He doesn't want to be buried.
On Friday morning, Meg went to school. She dragged her feet unwillingly because she didn't want to hear about the picnic. 20 minutes later, she came storming home again. She flew into the kitchen, almost frightening her mother to death. Mother thought something terrible must have happened. Why else would Meg come home during school hours looking so wild? Mother, Mother, Meg cried, panting. We're going to have a picnic. Now, today. There wasn't any on Wednesday. The teacher tripped on the stairs. Oh, I'm so happy. She got a brain concussion, too. I want hot chocolate in a thermos. Where is my dress? Quick, Mother, quick! When Ida came to do the Friday cleaning a little while later, she met Meg at the gate of June Hill. Meg was wearing a new dress and a sailor hat, and her face was glowing. Her knapsack bounced on her back as she pranced gaily along. I'm going on a picnic, she said. I'm so happy. Oh, said Ida. Wasn't it you who was lying in bed, screaming and wanting to be dead? Today, everything seems to have changed. Meg laughed. That was Sebastian Loki who wanted to be dead. And he is dead, too. It says so in the paper. Which paper? Asked Ida. I'm not going to tell, Meg said, laughing again. Then she took off for her picnic. She was going on a train. She was going to sit on a mountaintop and eat sandwiches. Small wonder that sparks seemed to fly around her.